Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, December 1st, 2021. Boy, hard to believe that we are now already in December, but we're rounding the corner on 2021 and looking forward to the new year. I'm sure I don't speak for just myself in that sentiment. As the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, I'm really pleased to kick off this discussion. We are going to cover a topic we don't talk about all the time, or perhaps even as much as we ought to. It's a very substantial topic, very important, and its issue kind of keeps rising in importance. It's privacy and how the tech and telecom industries approach or should approach. There's changes in the air, and it's certainly an issue of ongoing concern for companies in the tech and telecom spaces. And so at Broadband Breakfast, our motto is better broadband, better lives. And we are all about the infrastructure and how we get higher capacity infrastructure. We've done a lot of shows about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that just passed, and its importance in putting huge new sums of money, $65 billion over a number of years, into broadband infrastructure. But we also focus on the deployment and use of broadband and how it gets into the hands of people, if you will, how it is affecting people's lives. And one of the ancillary issues, maybe a collateral damage of our broadband and internet-enabled society, is privacy and concerns about privacy. And so today we're going to be speaking about this topic, how privacy is rising in the landscape of telecom and technology companies, both from the perspective of the marketplace, data breaches, security issues, as well as the power of big tech companies such as Google, Meta, Apple, et cetera, and how that forces other companies to react, right? To react to that. One of our guests has a great piece that talks about these very exciting changes to privacy that Apple and Google implemented, over the past year or so, and yet those in turn enhance the power of Apple and Google. So we certainly want to get into that, but we also want to speak about the policy landscape and how there's a number of states that have been driving this discussion. California, most particularly, has passed a significant privacy law. Obviously, American companies still are reacting to the GDPR, the General Data Protection regulations in Europe, and how that has driven a lot of developments too. So we're at a moment where privacy has probably been an anticipated goal of legislative efforts for 20 years now, and yet there has not been significant privacy legislation. Is that about to change? Well, that's one of the things we'll talk about here today too. So with that, I want to open it up to our guests and remind you, we're here every Wednesday. I'll talk a little bit later on about our upcoming programs, and also nod out and thanks to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast, for whom we're grateful allowing us to do programs like this. But let's go now to Jessica Deer and Kirk Nara. Jessica is the director of the Ranking Digital Rights program of New America. And we've done some stories about ranking digital rights on Broadband Breakfast. One of the linked articles, the panelist briefings, refers to this. This was 2 years ago we did this piece, and Ranking Digital Rights continues to do an annual survey, which Jessica will speak a little bit about, of tech and telecom companies on privacy, on free speech, on transparency. But we're really, really pleased that Jessica will join us and speak first about this set of issues. She'll be followed by Kirk Nara, who is a partner at WilmerHale in Washington, and he's co-chair of that firm's cybersecurity and privacy practice, as well as the co-chair of the big data practice. And Kirk is also a adjunct professor of privacy law at Washington College of Law at American University, and works as well with other universities. So let's turn it to you, Jessica. Tell us a little bit about ranking digital rights and how you arrived at this survey and what it says about our privacy landscape as it stands right now.
Great, Drew. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the introduction. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. So Ranking Digital Rights is a program, a research program that's based at the think tank New America in DC, but we have a global team. We have half of our team is in Europe and part are in Latin America and part here in DC. And what we do is advance transparency and corporate accountability in the tech and telecom sector for people's fundamental rights. We research companies' policies and their practices according to a set of indicators that have been developed with human rights experts over several years, and provide thought leadership and policy conversations with our reports, and support civil society and increasingly investor and shareholder advocacy for these companies or towards these companies. Our core product is the RDR Corporate Accountability Index. And in that index, which I'll share on my screen here, just so you can get, hopefully if I can do this properly, there we go. You can get sort of a sense of it. We rank the world's most powerful tech and telecom companies. One second, let me just organize my desktop. And a representative selection of the services that they operate. And what we do is we evaluate publicly disclosed policies like terms of service and privacy policies, as well as human rights policies and other sort of governance policies of 26 publicly traded companies against a set of human rights-based standards that are based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And these standards we've organized into 3 categories, which you can see here: governance, freedom of expression, and here, the topic of today, privacy. And I'll just focus right now on the privacy standards, and I'll sort of go to where our indicators are, and you can get a sense of the range on this side of the screen of what our indicators cover, which include access and clarity of privacy policies, whether or not they notify users of changes to those policies, how companies collect and handle user information, whether or not users have control over that information, and whether or not it's collected or sold to third parties. We evaluate company disclosures and their processes for how they respond to government demands and other demands for user information. And we also evaluate their disclosures on, if you sort of go down here, on security oversight, addressing security vulnerabilities, data breaches, and other risks. So the rankings and our indicators in general, and I'll stop sharing my screen for the moment, if I can do that easily, provide sort of a roadmap for companies to improve their policies and by extension, we hope their practices. And our sort of theory of change is that by creating this sort of these standards that we can encourage companies to sort of engage in a race to the top. And we've seen some impact. We've seen improvement. We've been publishing the index since 2015. We've seen improvement over time on a range of indicators, including human rights commitments, content moderation, transparency, data breach protocols, but we'd certainly like to see more. And it's probably worth noting that in the last 2 years, no company has scored above 60% in the privacy category, and overall, no company gets a passing grade. So there's still a lot of room for improvement. Our concerns about privacy and sort of what I wanted to sort of my talking points, if you will, for what we're sort of talking about today is just to remind everyone and sort of say that privacy is a fundamental human right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it enables, and by fundamental, it enables the enjoyment of other rights, and particularly the rights to free expression and freedom of association and assembly. So it's paramount for sort of the world that we live in now, especially as it gets increasingly more digitized. And transparency about company policies is paramount. It is the essential first step in holding them accountable for those rights. But of course, it's not enough. But it does help us set the baseline. And beyond that, we need to sort of advocate for use restrictions and strong oversight and auditing and enforcement of companies and their sort of the way that they manage users' privacy. And the other thing that we've seen over the years is that to lead and differentiate themselves on privacy, tech and telcos really have to go beyond the baseline standards in the letter of the law. The need for federal privacy legislation, we're in violent agreement with everyone advocating for federal privacy legislation, and again, see that as a first step, but not the only step that needs to be taken. But if telcos and tech companies really want to differentiate themselves, they need to go beyond the letter of the law and ensure that the data that they collect is essential to provide the service that they're offering, and that they provide users with options to control their data, and that they provide clear and actionable avenues for remedy. And sort of what our key concerns are, and what I think sort of responding to Drew's question is like, why are we sort of really all focused on privacy at this moment? Why do we think that perhaps there is an opportunity for legislation, for federal privacy legislation to pass or change? Is that over the last few years, I think there's the conversation about people's data has really come into the mainstream as a result of the surveillance-based business models of a lot of tech and telecom companies, which are in large part really just ad tech companies that also provide content services. Algorithmic systems and sort of the rise of big data over the last several years has really meant that a lot of companies' data collection is the primary purpose, so that there can be promotion of content for sure, but also sort of the inference of using that data to infer things about people that will help with targeting of advertising, that has had some negative effects, negative externalities that I think a lot of us are familiar with now, including disinformation around elections, around the pandemic, amplifying sort of hate speech and other sorts of ills. So what we're seeing really is that being able to protect privacy in the digital age is essential to being able to protect our other fundamental rights. What is known about you from a privacy and data perspective is what can determines in large part what information platforms, what these big platforms push to you through ads and news feeds. It can also limit your access to information if you're only receiving certain kinds of targeting. We've seen evidence that it can restrict if search results are dictated based on sort of what a company knows about you, that can impact your freedom of thought and opinion, and so can sort of repeated exposure to sensationalist or extremist content, especially if we're looking at sort of election cycles, et cetera. So that's just where I'll start, and I look forward to the rest of the hour and the rest of the conversation.
Jessica, let me ask two follow-ups here. One is about the tech versus telecom, and feel free to kind of. It's such an elegant display. I mean, I think you've either added a new strand from when we drilled into this and did our profile of you all in 2019. But having a tech standard and a telecom, just talk a little bit about why the two and what's different in terms of the privacy considerations for the big tech platforms like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple and the telecom / broadband companies. What is different about the privacy considerations they face?
Honestly, I was going back this morning, sort of looking at the different indicators that we use, and there's really not a lot of distinction. I think the distinction is pretty in terms of what companies should do for their users. And I think what's kind of interesting, and I say this because we did a piece last year, which I didn't share, but I can share today, about sort of the fact that a lot of telecom companies are now getting into the ad tech market, and how sort of kind of frightening this is in some ways, because telcos already have a whole lot of data about you that platforms, for example, don't have. Telcos know where you live. They can locate you geographically. They have your billing information and credit history and all sorts of things that Facebook and Google does not have by default. And so when you start to combine that information, which other companies can sell or create through third-party exchange agreements, get access to through third-party exchange or purchasing data, you start to really see what kinds of pictures these companies can have about us. And I think the biggest problem there is that companies have an immense amount of power now as a result of that, yet there's very little regulation and oversight. And so so I think in some ways we might think that telcos actually have a stronger obligation to data protection and privacy. Also, when you start to think about mobile money and things like that. But in our ranking specifically, we rank digital platforms. We evaluate their encryption standards and their account security standards, whereas we don't evaluate those for telcos for technical reasons. And then for telcos, we evaluate network management standards. So for example, are they committed to net neutrality in their policies? Do they participate in zero rating programs, which we frown upon? And what are their policies around network shutdowns, which is very important in parts of the world where governments do order shutdowns and restrict people's access to the internet to manage security crises and other sorts of things.
Yeah, good. One more quick question before we get Kirk into the conversation, and that is, how much of the current angst, I think I've heard the phrase surveillance capitalism multiple times each day for the last week and beyond. How much of that is driven by privacy, qua privacy, versus the, let's just say, antitrust or competitive market power of certain big tech platforms, versus concern about content moderation and the whole Section 230 issue flag that's been raised? What just help us disentangle this from your perspective, Jessica, of like which of these issues gets tackled first from a perspective of reining in the power of surveillance capitalism?
Well, in my particular opinion, I think we need to tackle them all at the same time. I don't think it's sort of a prioritization issue. I think surveillance-based capitalism, which was popularized as a term by Shoshana Zuboff's book in 2018 called the Age of Surveillance Capitalism, I believe, sort of laid out the case for a lot of what we're dealing with today, but it came on the heels of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the 2016 election as well. And I think people are just having sort of a moment over the last couple of years, especially as a result of all of us being forced online as a result of the pandemic, that people are paying a lot more attention to what that environment looks like and how it, and people have always thought it's been creepy, to get ads for things that you're talking about or emailing about. But I think it's just really hitting home now. And I think, it's that there's the antitrust aspect, but I think, and I think others are also starting to look at the fact that it's not about whether or not we separate WhatsApp from Instagram from Facebook. It's really about the fact that Facebook, Google, and Apple and other ad-based companies, they have vertically integrated the ad market in a way they control the market. They sell the ads, they place the ads, they charge fees on both ends of the transaction, if not in the middle. And that is where the real monopolistic and antitrust or practice is happening. And that unless we can break up the ad industry in some way, we won't succeed. And one of the things that you referenced the article, I think earlier, on first versus third party data, and Apple and Google's move into first party data. Google will start that, I think, either next year or in 2023, and Apple is sort of starting it now. But what happens in that conversation is, or in that move, is that Apple and Google are, they have access to a lot of data because we all have, those of us who use Apple devices and apps and whatever have those accounts. And Google is moving to what they're calling, it's called a federated learning of cohorts. I believe it's a very odd, jargony sort of word, but what happens is if a move to first party data may make us somewhat more private in the short term, but it actually pits privacy against competition, because it actually consolidates their power over sort of the long term. At least that's the way that we're sort of looking at it in the first analysis. And so there's antitrust, there is certainly privacy legislation, there are SEC rules that we think need to be changed in terms of dual class shares. So there's many different levers. There's some investor and shareholder advocacy, which I mentioned. And I really think that we need to be firing on all pistons to be able to counter this sort of huge asymmetry, it's very David and Goliath sort of specter between the companies and the individual user, which individually we have very little power.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. We've got a lot to talk about. Let's get Kirk's perspective in here. Tell us a little about yourself, your practice in privacy law, and as well as teaching, and what you view the current core issues in the landscape are.
Sure. So you started off talking about the Supreme Court case today. When I was in law school, privacy law really didn't exist, or at least it exists. Where it existed, it was essentially part of constitutional law, where it was, the government versus the individual. And we talked about abortion rights and birth control and whether you had to disclose that you were a member of the Communist Party. And obviously in the past, it's really about 20 years, goes back to the very late 90s. It has started to become a much more significant issue for corporate America, corporations around the world, not just corporate America. And so what I thought I wanted to do today was give you a little bit of a baseline of where we stand today on the law, and then talk a little bit about where things are going. One of the issues that's been talked about a lot, which is somewhat of where Jessica's coming from, is that there are lots of sort of market forces that have some role in driving privacy concerns, and there are standards and there are best practices and things like that. And the law side tends to look at, well, what else should we be doing on top of what people might be persuaded to do or choose to do? And so what we've seen in the United States is privacy laws that cover three general categories. And I want to clear up one thing. I mean, it's a little bit of a misnomer to say there isn't a privacy law in the United States. What we have is we have hundreds of them instead. And those laws have tended to be in three categories. First of all, and probably most known, are the sector-specific privacy laws. Most noticeably, that's Gramm-Leach-Bliley for the financial services industry, HIPAA for the healthcare industry, FERPA covers education. Your industry and the line between broadband and tech and telecom was actually part of the debate here, because we started to have these laws that were coming up driven by particular jurisdictions or particular strands of governmental authority. And the major issue that we came up with in the telecom space was that there was the authority of one regulatory agency to regulate certain companies, but they didn't have the authority to regulate a bunch of other companies that pretty much looked the same. And so this idea of sector-specific laws has actually created a lot of different problems. We saw that with your industry. We're seeing that, for example, in the healthcare industry, where the HIPAA rules apply to doctors and they apply to hospitals, but those rules don't apply to a ton of healthcare information that exists around the country. And so the idea of these sectors really are confusing and too limited and create inconsistencies across similarly situated groups of people. So sector-specific laws. Then we have laws that regulate certain kinds of practices, mainly marketing kinds of practice. So we have telemarketing, we have email marketing, we have fax marketing, we have the canned spam law. So there's a lot of laws dealing with marketing. Then we are starting to have laws dealing with particular data categories. Those can be federal laws that deal with things like genetic information. Those can be state laws that deal with things like facial recognition and biometric data. So that's the posture of US law. Lots of different laws in those different categories. But what that creates is kind of a mess from a lot of perspectives. You've got inconsistencies and overlaps and different standards and lots of things that are regulated many times and lots of things that aren't regulated at law at all. Compare that to what we see in Europe, for example. Drew mentioned the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. That is an effort to have a one-size-fits-all privacy law. It applies to everyone in Europe. I don't want to get into the details of who it applies to, but conceptually it applies to everyone in Europe, and it applies to all data regardless of the context in which that data comes up. Now, that's an alternative model. I don't want to say it's a better model, it's just a different model. And what we have in that model is we have broader coverage with far less nuance that we have under US law. When you have a law for the healthcare industry, we have really important nuance that allows the healthcare industry to actually work very well. And so that nuance doesn't exist under GDPR. So that's just a trade-off there, but that's sort of the background. Throwing into that background, we now move to the state laws that Drew mentioned, and that is largely started by the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act in California. That law is viewed by many people as a comprehensive privacy law. That is really a misunderstanding of what that law does. That law is essentially a gap-filling law, because what that law does is it applies to personal data and it regulates privacy practices related to personal data as long as that personal data isn't regulated by another law. So the list of exceptions to CCPA is actually enormous. And if you're regulated by healthcare rules, you're not covered by CCPA. If you're an employee, your data is not protected. I mean, a variety of things that aren't subject to that. That law passed. It passed due to some very peculiar details of how
You're breaking up a little bit, Kirk. I'm having difficulty hearing you. Kirk, I can't hear you right now. Are you still there? Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. No, sorry. You broke up on my end. We used to have this problem all the time, right? But I switched to a fiber symmetrical service, so I don't have the problem as much. But I apologize. I missed you. Can you hear us? So can you hear me okay right now, Kirk?
Yes, I can. I can hear you fine.
Please go ahead and continue. Okay. You were on a roll there, talking about the exceptions that are in the California.
Okay, so California law is really a gap-filling law because it covers your personal data if that personal data isn't already regulated by something else. So it's not GDPR one size fits all. It's if you don't have any protection already, now California will step in. But that law was passed through a very peculiar set of particular provisions and approaches in California. There was no choice but to pass a law, which meant it was passed very quickly. It wasn't drafted well. Let me be clear what I'm saying with that. I think the California law is not well written, independent of what you think of what they're trying to accomplish. It's just not written very well because it was written so fast. So what happened was once that law got passed, lots of states started thinking, well, maybe we should pass our own law. But what they're finding is that it's not as easy as that, because the California law, because of the process, basically skipped all of the lobbying efforts. And so when you go to another state, you find that there's actually regular lobbying efforts that go on. And so since the California law was passed, we've had efforts to pass a law in a variety of states. But at this point, we only have two other states that have passed the law, Colorado and Virginia. Neither one of those laws is yet in effect. And so we are going to continue to see those laws be introduced in 2022, introduced in 2023. I think they are going to slowly start to add to the list. But we're now having a situation where we're just adding more laws to the list without creating a single kind of standard. So what is happening is that we're seeing continued pressure at the state level. At the same time, and somewhat in parallel, we're seeing pressure for a federal law. As Drew alluded to, there's been efforts at a federal law going back to the late 90s when the internet first started getting going. I think there is more interest today than there really has ever been, but we're not there yet. Congress is carefully looking at these issues. All the interest groups are taking positions. There's lots of bills, there's lots of hearings, et cetera. My personal view, and we can get into the details of this a little bit later, my personal view is that the real pressure point for a federal law is not going to come from privacy advocates, but it's going to come from business. And it's going to come from business once about 3 or 4 other states pass their own laws. I think that corporate America is going to say at that point, we can't handle 6 or 8 or 10 state laws that all say different things. We need a federal law. And so I think that's going to be the pressure point, and we're going to watch that going forward. But again, really interesting time, lots going on, lots of technological developments, lots of regulatory developments, lots of political developments, and happy to dive into any of those in the rest of our conversation.
Great, thank you, and appreciate you adapting here, rolling forward. Maybe we try to get your video screen back on here as the internet stabilizes. So Kirk, just a quick follow up for you. So, just walk me through why it's so problematic to have several state laws here, right? And again, Kirk alluded to this. I spent this morning, I didn't expect to, but I spent this morning listening to the live stream of the Mississippi abortion law argument at the Supreme Court. And hence the notion of privacy was on my mind, because that's, some decades ago, privacy tended to be thought of in that more personal bodily context. But what I wanted to ask you about is the core argument of those who, want to change the status quo on abortion law in the United States is, hey, we don't need a federal law covering this. Let the state law decide. Now, I recognize this is not our bailiwick of issues here at Broadband Breakfast, but I just want to ask that core federal question. Yeah. Why is it so problematic to deal with some different state laws, Kirk?
Well, so I mean, I don't want to get too far into the abortion complex, but put it this way: if you are someone who is interested in having an abortion, you're not having 50 abortions in 50 states. You're having, you're having an abortion where you live, and there's a particular set of independent of that debate. What we see in the privacy law debate is that data is not in a place. It's not a specific place in a particular time. You might be a resident of, as a consumer, you're a resident of wherever you're a resident. I'm a resident of Maryland. And so from the rights of the consumer perspective, it's really one law at a time. And I get that. And there are, so people in California today have more specific legislative privacy rights than people who live in Maryland. That is certainly a fact. However, if you look at the company perspective, they don't operate that way. And they operate certainly nationally in most companies, and they are increasingly operating at an international level. And so if you say to, and again, I understand that nobody has any sympathy for these big companies, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, one of the points that I think Jessica was alluding to is, if you're talking about the biggest companies in the world, you know what? They can decide. They can hire me, frankly. They can hire they can spend all the money they need to make all this work eventually. If you're a retailer who's trying to sell stuff around the country, and you've got an online website and you got stores, if you've got different states and say, in this state, you need contracts and say these words, and you need to give consumers these rights, and you need to have this issue with what you can and cannot market to them. And you can't manage that. You can't run your business that way. And so again, we may be moving down that path. That's the path we're going through right now.
Right.
What a federal law would do is it would say, let's set a baseline. My personal view is that each time there's a state law that passes, that federal baseline rises. It's going up and up and up. So I think what we're gonna be moving towards is a federal law that's a pretty strong law, but creates some consistencies, which I think is beneficial for everybody. We can certainly have a debate about it.
So, Jessica, what is your perspective, having looked at globally at this issue of this federal versus state issue? This comes up all the time in many other contexts of commerce, and business obviously tends to say, hey, we can't deal with all these different states. We need a single set of rules. But again, I mean, are we really there at that tipping point where where there is momentum from business for a federal privacy regime?
I mean, I would defer to Kirk on that, but I would imagine that there is for exactly the reasons that he was stating. And it's, I guess, from our point of view, one of the reasons why we use the human rights framework rather than US law or GDPR, for example, to do our evaluations is because they are global and these companies are operating global. And if you sort of, extrapolate or transpose that to the state and federal system that we have in the US, I think harmonization of those laws and establishing that baseline is a very important thing to do. And it's what we saw the GDPR do. For all of its faults, it has created sort of a baseline of privacy legislation in not just in Europe, but also there's been a lot of sort of what do they call it? But like jurisdictional sort of traveling or whatever of that law. It's been adopted. There are a lot of countries that just say, okay, GDPR, we don't have the time, the resources, the expertise maybe to develop our own legislation on this. Let's sort of adapt and adopt it and use it as a template for our own laws. And not only that, but companies who want to operate in Europe, which includes even civil society organizations who would just like to send a newsletter to people based in Europe or operate a website that people from Europe can access, also have to comply with GDPR. GDPR is by no means perfect, but I think it does, it is a model for at least, it does justify or give a good argument for why federal privacy legislation. I didn't mean to say, if I did, I misspoke, that there was no privacy legislation, because there is lots of sectoral and all of the categories that Kirk, but I think we do need federal privacy legislation. And I'll even say, like, the US wants to lead on internet freedom and other sorts of policies globally, and it's very difficult, in my opinion, for them to do that without having sort of this very explicit legislative commitment to privacy at the federal level.
Can I add something on that, Drew?
Please.
I think that, companies in the United States have a variety of different perspectives on a national privacy law. There are clearly some companies that would prefer there not to be any privacy laws. Absolutely. I think the number of those companies is growing. Is shrinking because they're recognizing that we're going to have something. On the other end, you have companies who would like to see a US law that meets global standards. The number of companies that are doing that is not very large, but they are very important companies. So you have a number of very influential big global companies who would like to see a global standard. You also have lots of companies who would just like to see a standard that they can shoot at. One of the lines that I use, and I don't think companies would go as far as I go on this, but one of the things that I say is, give me one law, I don't even care what it says. And, because I think the idea of consistency and clarity, and that's one of the things that we're seeing with GDPR. GDPR is not, GDPR has not eliminated the need for privacy lawyers. We still have to spend a ton of time figuring out what GDPR means, but we're all at least looking at the same standard and we're trying to evaluate that. We are absolutely not in that place in the United States right now. And I think that, my personal view, just to jump ahead a little bit, is that the current state of US privacy law is bad for consumers, increasingly bad for business. The only people it's good for is me, because companies need, they can't figure it out. And so a ton of my work is just, how do I make sense of all this stuff? They're not trying to avoid it. They're not trying to get around. They just want to understand what to do. And that's really hard when there's so many different laws that apply in different contexts. And these new state laws are making that situation even worse and will continue to make it worse. Again, until the point, I think this is coming. I don't think we're there yet, where companies are going to say, we need something to make it, to stop it from keep getting worse.
So I want to come to the specific standards. And Jessica, would you mind going ahead and sharing your screen again on what you showed earlier in those? It looked like 18 points on privacy. And I want to kind of, you have some bolded and others not bolded. And I'm not sure if that's because they're, given a greater weight in your standards here. But
can you see it now?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You start off with access, notification, and I want to kind of frame this as we chatted about earlier, Jessica, like, why is notice and choice the kind of default framework? Are there other ways to look at, like, so now let's just say we're getting to the point that businesses and consumers want some kind of privacy protections on a federal level, substantive protections. Obviously, there's sectoral protections. There's, certain areas like children's privacy, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act in the United States, 1998. But what are the principles that should underlie a privacy law if it were to be adopted?
Well, I think I hear a couple of different questions. So one is sort of like, what are the standards? I mean, these are the standards that we've developed, and they're human rights-based standards. And then the second question is about notice and consent. So in terms of the standards, as I said at the outset, what we really try to do is evaluate, because it's the first step, how transparent are companies about their policies related to these three categories, including privacy. So for us, the essential baseline is, can a user access your privacy policy? And can they, we're global, as I mentioned in the chat. So can they access it in the primary language of the market, of the home market? And we have what you can do when you go to, and I can put the link in, when you go to our index, you can sort of see, access to privacy policies. You can see what the different questions are that we ask. And it's a very complex index, so I'll try and keep it as high level, but anybody is welcome to explore. And you can see what the research guidance is here. And you can see down here what the scores are. Access companies are doing relatively well. So, when we go back to the different indicators, so, we have access. Here in 2020, we had developed a new set of indicators that were really meant to get at the surveillance capitalism sort of business model, or the targeted advertising business model, and the big data sort of prioritization of content, et cetera. And so we developed indicators relating to algorithmic systems and to targeted advertising. So you'll also see those in here, and that's we can talk more about that if we want to. Changes, whether or not a privacy policy changes. I mean, they're all relatively commonsensical. How does a company collect user information? You can look at the different elements here. Does it just and we are, just to be very clear, not evaluating practice, because these companies are very opaque, can be very opaque about their practices. We're evaluating what they disclose. What is it that they say that they do? And then some of our indicators try to get at what they actually do by asking if there are policies or processes around that. So, but we're really looking at transparency as sort of the first step. And the different, let me go back here, you can navigate this way as well. Sort of the different privacy, actually it's easier this way. So you can sort of go through the list, and it's funny, Drew, these should all be bolded. So, but some of them are sub indicators. This is just a typographical error, basically, or whatever you call that in the web environment.
Would you mind clicking on the very top, P1B, access to algorithmic system development policies? So yeah, it looks like a pretty bad grade.
It's pretty bare. Yeah.
What is Telefonica doing that no one else is doing here, Jessica?
Well, they're disclosing a whole lot more information about how their algorithmic systems work. And if we look at the elements, so what they're doing for each of these questions, can you find an algorithmic system development policy? Yes. Are they available in the primary language? Yes. And are they understandable? I mean, there's really a very low baseline, but that's how they get 100%. And nobody else is disclosing any of those. We're hoping that in the next ranking, which will be out in April, and will focus exclusively on the digital platforms, that you'll be able, that we'll see some improvement. But if you go sort of scroll through all the lists of companies, you can see that nobody's disclosing anything except for Telefonica.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And Drew, let me jump in on that for a second. I mean, so notice and choice is the core of current US privacy law. That means that every consumer, pretty much every time you go to a website, has a privacy policy that you can look at. I am not going to take a poll of the people on this call, but I am willing to bet that none of you ever look at any of these privacy policies. And so these carefully written, I mean, again, I write a lot of them. but with this carefully written set of privacy policies, the way US law works generally today is if you say it in the privacy policy and you don't lie about it and you don't skip something that's important, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And so that's a real question as to how whether that's a meaningful set of privacy protections. And it relates to one of the core discussions that we are seeing, although I don't think either the states or Congress is paying enough attention to this, which is there are definitely people who say give consumers more control. So if I give you more control, what that means is that every time you're going to go to a website, you're going to have 150 choices about how that website's going to operate, and you're not possibly going to be able to exercise that choice in any meaningful way. And so one of the questions that we're debating, in fact, I'm in a program tomorrow that's a more academic program where this is a core topic of discussion, is what about an alternative to this whole notice and choice idea? I mean, for example, you could argue that Europe has that. Europe has notice provisions, and it has some situations where choice is relevant. But for the most part, companies have to identify whether their data collection and use and disclosure practices meet some standards that are set out in GDPR. The best place to see that model in the United States is in the HIPAA rules in the healthcare industry, which is consent is really not a meaningful part of the healthcare structure. Doctors, hospitals, and other folks who are regulated by HIPAA have a particular set of things that they are allowed to do with data, the normal stuff in the healthcare industry. And if they want to do things that are outside the norm, that's when they have to go get your permission. But it's an alternative approach. And I think that that we're certainly seeing, although a lot of this discussion is in the academic settings right now, we're seeing basically views that say notice and choice doesn't work because there's too much notice and there's no way that people can meaningfully exercise their choice.
So what else? What else is there? What else is there, Kurt, besides those choice? What are other ways to protect privacy?
So what my suggestion, I didn't send it. I'll send this article along, Drew. I like the HIPAA model a lot. The HIPAA model says, let's define a set of norms. What's normal in the healthcare industry? It's called treatment. It's called payment, and there's something called healthcare operations. It's basically administrative activities of running a healthcare business. If a hospital or a doctor or health insurer is doing those things, it's sort of automatic. They can just do it. If they want to do something that's unusual, they need your permission. So you obviously can't say to a bank, oh, go do treatment and payment for health. Yeah, but the idea would be something like context. What would a consumer normally expect to happen with your data? Let's make that easy. Let's get rid of this whole idea that you have to choose to do that. Let's focus choice on stuff that actually matters. Now, defining what that norm is obviously a challenge. But I think conceptually, that's how I would focus attention, is say, here's what's normal. You're allowed to do what's normal. If you want to do something that's uncommon, that's unexpected, that's out of the norm, then you need to go reach out and get permission. I think that's a viable option. We just haven't really moved to that yet in the United States outside of the healthcare context. And we're seeing more and more, particularly academic statements saying the notice and choice has failed and here are some alternatives. I think we have to really focus our attention on that. I will tell you, however, in the federal debate, there are two issues that are dominating the federal debate. And those issues are taking up 89.6% of the discussion time. And so all the merits of an actual privacy law are not being discussed enough. The two issues that we're paying attention to that are taking up all the oxygen are, first of all, whether there will be preemption of state laws. Will this federal law supplement state laws or replace state laws? Business obviously wants the state laws to be replaced. That's a complicated discussion. The second point is whether there will be a private right of action. Will consumers be able to sue for a violation of this law? Those 2 points are dominating the debate, and disagreement on those 2 points is what has prevented a federal law from moving forward at this point. My concern, however, is that even if we get a compromise on those two things, there's a whole bunch of other substance of the privacy law that we haven't spent much time on. And I'm kind of worried that we're going to end up with a not very good law. And again, not very good, not in it's pro-privacy or anti-privacy, just not very good because it's not thoughtful, it's not well written, it's not careful. So that's very much part of the discussion at this point.
Let me throw in one more question. I want to get Jessica's reactions to that, but Charles Baldwin asked a question. opt-in, opt-out is a failed framework for self-regulation. We used to hear a lot about that term opt-out, but it seems to have receded. And, like on email marketing privacy, right, it's more of an opt-in is the default of the CAN-SPAM Act.
No, that's not right. CAN-SPAM is 100% opt-out. It's exactly opt-out. And it works for CAN-SPAM. It just doesn't mean opt-out is the norm right now on a website. If you go to the website and you keep using the website, you haven't opted out, and therefore you're going forward.
So let me ask Jessica the question about opt-in versus opt-out, as well as what considerations need to be taken in the specifics of a federal privacy law.
Well, I mean, I guess, just repeating some of what Kirk was saying, like all of the burden right now seems to be on the user and reading the long, I often call for people that are outside of our field, what do we do? We read the policies so you don't have to, basically, and we sort of bring the companies because that's all we do is read their policies. And if I think opt-in is better, and the opt-in, opt-out regime or different versions of it is better than not having any choice, but it still keeps all of the burden on the user to understand what they're opting in and opting out of. And I think this is why, as a privacy advocate, and as many of us are really wanting some sort of baseline standard for these sorts of things. And I think, there are a lot of different proposals for alternatives to sort of the current notice and unmeaningful consent regime, where you have, it's a binary question. Are you going to use the service or are you not going to use the service? I mean, in most cases, in some cases now you can, like for cookies, or example, you can choose which cookies you want. But I mean, even though I can do that on some GDPR sort of government sites, I almost never do because it's very time consuming. That's not what I came to do. So I think this is where the role of regulation needs to come in and set that baseline that we're talking about. And in terms of alternatives to, I think the other part about opting in and opting out that we look at is around the algorithmic systems, and specifically whether or not I think this is one of the things that Apple recently created a big dust up over, the fact that it was going to change its privacy policies and the tracking with the app developers so that you have to opt in if you want, if a developer can use your data, you have to opt in and explicitly tell them that they can do that. And obviously most people have not done that. So yeah, is it perfect? No. Is it better than nothing? Yes. And I don't know what all the other, alternatives are. People talk about data trusts or data fiduciaries.
Yes.
I think, putting your data, in an independent place and then moving it around. I mean, all of these seem kind of onerous, and until somebody makes them easy to do and easy to evaluate and sort of audit and all of that, I think we have some complex problems to solve.
I want to come back to this topic of tech versus telecom and the privacy issues and considerations. And I should note to those who watch it, we stream on multiple platforms. Obviously, we're on Zoom here, and there's a very lively discussion on our Zoom chat that those of you who are on Zoom, but many people see this as well through the website and through Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. So that won't be captured there unless we bring it into the discussion. And so there's this real lively debate here about kind of net neutralities mixed in. And I think almost in some ways, the difference between the privacy calculus for an ISP versus the privacy calculus for a tech platform. And let me just kind of try to summarize or channel this debate. I mean, it seems to be that the ISPs, they're kind of like, quote, on the customer's side. They need to kind of guard the privacy of the customer, or they're going to get selected out. People are going to go to someone else. Whereas the tech platform sort of they're like trying to entice as much data as they can out of people. That's a very oversimplified version of this discussion dialogue in the chat window. but obviously Jessica and and Kirk, you can see that dialogue and respond to it. What I want to ask, the twist is, Jessica, you made such a great point earlier that the ISPs have personal data that the tech platforms don't have it by default. So that kind of in some ways gives them a greater potential to abuse personal data. But I would very much like, your take on some of this discussion we're seeing about who really is more likely to be the agent or the trustee of a consumer's data and privacy. Let's hear both of your reaction. First, you, Jessica.
Who's more likely to, are we saying are ISPs more likely to protect people's data? I really think it depends on the market. As I've mentioned, we look at companies operating globally, and telcos, I guess another big distinction when you're looking at telcos is they're much more closely regulated by governments, and they operate sort of at the pleasure of governments in many jurisdictions. Which is why governments can order them to shut down. ISPs are the same in many jurisdictions as well. I think the conversation, from what I've been able to sort of glean from the chat, is a very specific. There's a very specific issue, sort of that's being alluded to, and maybe a much more specific definition of network neutrality in terms of the regulations that have been proposed and rescinded, et cetera, in the United States. But when we talk about network neutrality, we're really talking about whether or not, for example, we're talking about sort of content and, if someone wants to make the connections for me, I'm not an expert on sort of these broadband issues, but, on prioritization of content, which in a global context can really create issues with access and digital divide and things like that. When you look at zero rating, for example, and the fact that many telcos and tech companies like Facebook will create partnership agreements whereby if you subscribe to a certain telephone network, you will get access to Facebook without using any data, which basically—
Does Facebook do that? Do we have evidence that Facebook has either globally or here in the United States?
Oh, yes, absolutely. They've done it. But if I can share my screen one more
Please.
time,
Go ahead. Yes.
I can show you that it looks very much like the algorithmic systems policy when you look at, hopefully I get to the right one, network management, and we ask about zero rating programs, and basically I think, if I'm not mistaken, well, we have a graph somewhere, and it might not be in here, but basically no company really discloses very much information about their zero rating programs. I'll try and find it and link to it in the chat. So
okay. Kirk, what are your thoughts on the issue of tech or telecom companies being a guardian of consumers' privacy? Is that when tech or telecom companies come to you on privacy issues, do they want to have that role, and what would help them to be an effective guardian of consumers' personal data?
Well, I think there's a couple of pictures here. So one is whether there should be a line between those two, whether they are in fact different. And I think that's one of the conclusions I would take away from what's happened over the last, say, dozen years, is there's no reason to distinguish in terms of the regulatory posture. I think that there's two, the sector specific approach that we've had in the United States leads to problems because those sectors are never well defined and never clearly distinguished. And over time they change. And I just think that hasn't worked very well. I guess maybe this goes to the question of whether, what's law versus something else. If companies wanted to step up and say, we're going to be a guardian, you can look at a couple of the companies who are on Jessica's list, and they have tried to make privacy a marketing message and a competitive advantage. I don't want to get into the details of whether I think they work or not. Companies in that category might be my clients. I don't want to, but that's a real question, right? I'm not sure that that's the job of an industry to say we're going to be, as an industry, a protector. Now, I think there are norms, and I think there are things like security standards where, privacy is trickier than security. Nobody supports bad security, right? Nobody supports security breaches. You may support broader use of personal data, and there may be positives for broader use of personal data. I think that's a real challenge. I don't see any of these industries as being self-designated as we're going to protect people's privacy. I do think there are business considerations. I do think there are branding considerations. But I think what we're learning is that there should be a law that says something about what these standards are.
Jessica, any additional thoughts on that point before we go to closing thoughts?
No, I think I agree. And I encourage everyone on the call who is, writing these policies to look at our standards and see if they might make some good baseline standards, because obviously we think they do.
Well, and I think you've done such an amazing job at Rankin Digital Rights of articulating out and saying these are the principles. And again, year after year, you've done this 4, 5, or 6 years, and that's incredibly impressive. So we really appreciate you taking the time being with us. Before I thank our guests, I just want to remind people that we are here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Next Wednesday, we are going to be here online, but we will also be in person at Clyde's of Gallery Place for a discussion about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act's implementation. And then on the 15th, 2 weeks from today, we're going to be talking about public-private partnerships in broadband deployment. I want to thank our sponsors, Utopia Fiber, Lit Communities, Broadband Now, Broadband Money, Samsung, Render Networks, Powerhouse Management, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. And want to especially thank our 2 guests for being with us and sharing their knowledge and insight, Jessica Deere and Kirk Nara. Any quick 30-second final thoughts that we can take with us as we think about the next steps on privacy?
Yeah, pay attention to the federal developments, pay attention to the state developments, and start thinking about what you're looking for your set of your companies, your industry. There's a lot of room to impact this debate at this point, because it's that very little of the federal debate is set in stone right now. So it's a good time to get involved.
Final thoughts, Jessica.
I'm sort of stuck on the ISPs and the upcoming events for broadband breakfast, and I think one of my areas so our indicators have been applied to ISPs, as I mentioned somewhere, and there's an adaptation that looks at New York City, and I've been wanting to think about how they can apply to ISPs who are taking advantage of the broadband funding. And so, if anybody's interested in talking about that, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, thank you again. On behalf of Kirk and Jessica, I'm Drew Clark. Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Take care, everybody.